Good morning, everyone. My name is Krystyna Ciecierski, and I am a professor of economics here at NEIU. I am also one of the principal investigators of ChicagoCHEC, which is a large U54 grant here at NEIU. Together with Lydia Filus, we are also the founding directors of the Center of Health at Northeastern. And we are very happy to open today's session. This is the last session of this year's Women in Science conference series. Very delighted to see so many individuals in the room. And as I understand, over 20 participants, maybe close to 30 now on Zoom. Thank you so much. And I'll introduce Lydia and give her the mic for a few seconds.
As you can see, we have these colorful t-shirts that signalize it's another, in fact, the 5th Women in Science conference, and this year is devoted to biological anthropology. And this is my great pleasure to introduce our president, Gloria Gibson, who is with this series of conferences with us from the very beginning, from the first moment she arrived to campus, and very supportive of women in science. President Gibson.
Thank you, Lydia. And this is just a wonderful, wonderful day. And I would like to thank, well, you know what? I know that we have women faculty right here at NEIU who are doing just fabulous, fabulous things in the sciences. So I think let's take a second to acknowledge all the wonderful work of our faculty. So could you just stand so we can acknowledge all of the wonderful work that you're doing? Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, Krystyna, for your leadership as well. And you know, the president gets to come to some of these things and listen and learn, but there's a lot of other leadership of the university that also, you know, is a part of this. So I have to acknowledge Lisa, I have to acknowledge our dean for their work and support of our women in science. So thanks to both of you as well. I won't be long, but I do want to just acknowledge thanking you for the opportunity to be here and to share a little with you. I am not a scientist. I love science, but my educational trajectory went a different way, although I can relate somewhat as an ethnomusicologist and a folklorist to the process, the research process of doing field work. And for me, when I was an active scholar, that was the fun part, to do the field work. And then you collect all of this knowledge and interviews and data, and then you come back to your office and you have to put it all together, or your lab, you have to put it all together. For me, that was the not so fun part, but it is just absolutely fabulous, this conference and sharing that knowledge. So thank you all for being here today. Through this conference, and it has been a wonderful conference, we celebrate and we learn about women in science and their accomplishments. Women contribute to what we call here at NEIU breaking barriers. Our women scientists break barriers, and they make significant contributions to the sciences. And again, I just want you to know how proud I am of our women faculty, staff, and students, and all of our faculty, staff, and students in the sciences. Our students especially benefit from these types of conference presentations. So I am, again, very happy and pleased to welcome our forensic anthropologist, Dr. Ann Ross, to be with us today. Thank you very much. Her presentation, Modern Perspectives on Human Variation in Forensic Anthropology, opens the door for our students to better understand research, fieldwork, and careers in biological anthropology. Crossing academic boundaries is the mode of research for the future. It is the mode of research for today. One of the goals of our future capital campaign is to provide additional opportunities for our students to be engaged in internships. And we know today that our students need those opportunities. And might I add, the goal is for paid internships for our students. Our capital campaign will also look at opportunities for our students to have more mentorships with, faculty here at Northeastern and also beyond the walls of Northeastern, to have scholarship opportunities in STEM and to promote more research between our faculty and our students, because we know that research becomes very important as we work to retain and promote our faculty and our students. So I want to, in closing, thank the organizers of this conference. Let's give them another hand. And we will all be working diligently to encourage, educate, and empower our little young girls, our young women, to think about the sciences and to be more engaged, to become those future women scholars in the sciences for the future. And I would say, if we don't have a STEM science summer camp, that might be something we want to think about for the future, to encourage our students to think more actively about the sciences. And let me just add this one last thing. When I was a dean, I did have a summer camp. And back in those days, CSI was really popular. A little way. I know there's still some CSI, but the original CSI. And so as dean, we had a CSI summer camp. And so the students were brought in, they had a little orientation. And then the next thing we did, we took them to the crime scene. And we actually had another student or students who, were not alive. And they learned how to do science through that opportunity in summer camp. They learned how to use the labs. They learned how to interact with people who may have done the crime. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to introduce students to various aspects of science and working in labs. And we ended the camp with an actual moot court experience, because the students had to, they had to find out who done it, who did the crime. And so so we combined a lot of different areas in the sciences, in pre-law, pre-med, and it was a wonderful experience for the students to be on campus working closely with faculty during that week. So at any rate, whatever we can do to encourage our students to that first year, second year, to go into the sciences, to go into STEM, to go into, forensic anthropology. I think we should be open to those ideas to encourage our students. So thank you all for being here. And I have to leave, but I understand the lecture will be recorded, so I hope to watch it when I have some quiet downtime. So again, thank you all so much.
Thank you, President Gibson. And now is the time for our own Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, also a big supporter of sciences, Katrina Bell Jordan.
Good morning. Thank you, Lydia. And thank you, Dr. Gibson, for your morning greetings as well. I'm very excited to be here this morning on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences and Northeastern. It is a pleasure to be a second welcome to the folks here in Alumni Hall and to the folks at home or wherever you are as we introduce the closing session of the 5th Annual Women in Science Conference. And I think that deserves a hand. We don't get to the 5th annual anything without a lot of effort. Northeastern is very proud that the Women in Science Conference brings us together each year to highlight STEM research and teaching and to provide opportunities to engage our students interested in STEM. As Dr. Gibson referred to, this year's theme is biological anthropology, and this has resulted in NEIU featuring 3 biological anthropologists who we have hosted for 2-day visits over the last 3 weeks. Phew, to the planners. And that included genetic anthropologist Dr. Jada Ben-Torres from Vanderbilt University, primatologist Dr. Jill Pruitz from Texas State University, and today's guest scholar, forensic anthropologist Dr. Ann Ross from North Carolina State University. The Women in Science Conference at NEIU is truly a signature program for the college and for the university. And each year we showcase the outstanding accomplishments of women across a variety of scientific disciplines and fields of study. Past conference themes have focused on the contributions of women in chemistry, mathematics, physics, and biology. And again, as we know, this year's focus is on biological anthropology. But all of these themes continue the Women in Science Conference practice of recognizing the substantial contributions of some of the greatest women in scientific history, highlighting the advances that women continue to make to scientific inquiry and discovery, and encouraging our students to pursue STEM majors. Dr. Gibson said it very well. That's our mission and our goal for women and other members of underrepresented groups to consider and seek a future in the STEM field. It's also important to note that the annual Women in Science Conference reflects a strong record of the sciences at NEIU. That is the strength of NEIU's STEM curriculum, the high impact teaching practices and research our STEM faculty engage in, and the impact of their engagement with faculty student research experiences, mentorship, and other professional development opportunities. And our STEM programs really are committed to this. And our Student Center for Science Engagement also is committed to offering students interested in STEM opportunities to explore and to pursue careers in this area. As I'm sure you know, the annual Women's Science Conference is sponsored and supported by the NEIU Center of Health and Chicago Health Equity Collaborative, also known as ChicagoCHEC. Chicago Cancer Health Equity Collaborative, also known as ChicagoCHEC. This is a significant partnership between NEIU, Northwestern University, and the University of Illinois at Chicago in advancing cancer research, education, training, and community engagement. We value this partnership tremendously and the collaboration that helps make this conference and many other programs possible at NEIU. And on behalf of the college and university, I'd like to recognize the support and work of the Women in Science Conference Planning Committee and all of the work that goes into making this year's 3-week conference series an exceptional display of scholarship and student engagement. Specific thanks goes to the leadership of Dr. Lisa Davis and Dr. Tracy Lupke from the Anthropology program in designing and coordinating this year's conference program, Dr. Lydia Felis and Dr. Christina Czechersky for their stewardship of the yearly annual Women in Science Conference and for their continued leadership of the ChicagoCHEC grant at NEIU. And of course, the many administrative staff who worked quietly and tirelessly to make the conference so successful each year. So with that said, welcome again, and I thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Davis to introduce our guest scholar. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone in the house and online. I understand we have a healthy online presence from around the country, which is awesome. So welcome, everyone. Just a quick note that those of you who are remote, who are Zooming in, there will be time at the end for questions. Please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'm not sure how Alicia is setting it up, but watch the screen and you'll be able to see, and we will make sure that your questions get asked. So please don't hesitate to do that. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I promise when I'm done talking, you'll actually see Dr. Ross at the podium. We will not have any more delays after me. Dr. Ross is a skeletal biologist and a board-certified forensic anthropologist. She received her BA degree in Spanish and Latin American Studies from Rollins College and a second BA in anthropology from Florida Atlantic University. She earned both her master's degree and her PhD degrees in anthropology at the University of Tennessee, a preeminent institution for forensic anthropology. Currently, Dr. Ross is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at North Carolina State University and directs the North Carolina Human Identification and Forensic Anthropology Lab. She also works cases for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in North Carolina. She maintains a research associateship at the Smithsonian Institution and is the vice president of the Forensic Anthropology Society of Europe, among other professional appointments. Dr. Ross has a prolific publication record in skeletal biology in a diversity of high-impact journals. She has co-authored or edited 3 books on the topics of abuse indicators in juvenile skeletons, bioarchaeology of the pre-Columbian Caribbean, and the complexities of dismemberment trauma. Dr. Ross also co-developed an analytical software called 3D-ID that uses geometric morphometric data to analyze crania for indicators of sex and population affinity. Dr. Ross's publications not only report her findings on various research projects, but are also distinguished by their effect of reforming or effect on reforming forensic anthropology and taking on complex or controversial topics. This is the type of scholarship that really helps to move a discipline forward. In the field, Dr. Ross has worked to identify unknown remains from the Hurricane Katrina disaster and the Port-au-Prince earthquake in Haiti. She also has a solid record of human rights work in Panama, Bosnia, and Chile, for which she has been recognized with awards. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Ross.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, for that, although a little exaggerated, but okay. I'll put this over here. Spill. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate everyone being here today. I appreciate the invitation for coming today.
Dr. Davis gave you a little bit of history of how I became a forensic anthropologist. Biological anthropology, if no one really knows, it's a very broad discipline, and forensic anthropology is just a very, it's the applied aspect of the more theoretical, broader discipline that includes everything from primates, paleontology, bioarchaeology. And so forensic anthropology is the application of the methodologies that we use in more theoretical frameworks to context, medical legal contexts. Medical legal contexts meaning issues of contemporary human remains when they are found either unidentified or we know who they are and they need someone to actually assess, for example, trauma on bone. So we are experts on bone, whereas a medical examiner, forensic pathologist is a soft tissue expert. So we get folded into their work and to assess the specifics of everything that happens to bone, including making identifications via radiographs or x-rays, right? But today I'm not really going to talk about forensic anthropology. I'm going to talk about an aspect of forensic anthropology. The last couple of years, forensic anthropology as a discipline has been going through some changes. Actually, we've really been going through some of these changes over the last 30 years, but no one has been paying attention. So one of the aspects of forensic anthropology is when we have an unidentified decedent, meaning a person without a name, we don't know who they are they are found without an ID, we can't make an ID. So one of the first things for a forensic anthropologist does for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner is develop a biological profile. What does that mean? Well, we can tell you how old the person was when they died. We can tell you how tall they were when they were alive. We can tell you what biological sex they were. And this is the controversial part. We can estimate population affinity. Population affinity meaning place of origin. It used to be called 30 years ago race. That was changed to ancestry. And now there's a huge change in the discipline to move forward to change that to population affinity. And I will explain to you through this talk why that is a necessary change. And a lot of these changes, the work in the last couple of years that I have been doing that are highlighted by the 3 papers at the top of the slide are issues in forensic anthropology back on the frontier of racism. And this is a big part of the discussion when we're dealing with this aspect of the biological profile. Another issue is the tools that are being used to make these assessments, right, are antiquated. They are not couched in proper scientific rigor. The scientific design is highly flawed. And so some of these things that we're doing, and it's a huge conversation within our discipline that we're coming to a reckoning at this point that we need to change. Other things that have happened that includes Black Lives Matter movement, George Floyd, the MOVE movement at the University Penn Museum. All of these things have put anthropology at the forefront that we actually really have to discuss, see it to a head and make some changes. And so this is one of the things that my team and I have been doing to actually start some of these changes and make some changes, in fact, that are part of our standards. We have a American Standards Board, which is part of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. And there's a document that is still kind of contentious to make these changes part of our standard operating procedures, right? So our basic standards, we need to change those. So that's what we're doing right now to get that started and get that moving and get people trying to think about this in a different manner. It worked. So we started out with a critical review, and I'm not gonna tell you about pre-1990s review. That has been discussed ad nauseum. Biological anthropology has had a very ugly, its roots hindered in racism, eugenics, typology, you know, all of these things. So those things I'm not going to discuss today, but we're going to discuss the post-1990s movement, which hasn't been discussed in much of the literature. And this is based on one of our papers that with Dr. Palud from UNLV, that we outline how to make these changes. We outline where these things have gone wrong and a path forward, right? So we're outlining a path forward and to return. So one of the things that happened in the 90s is that there was a conflict between traditional biological anthropologists. This is the 1990s. This actually started with a paper by Lieberman in 1987 that presented at the AAPAs now, or the AABAs. And they did a survey about how many people believed in the concept of race. 50% of the participants of that survey said that, yes, they believed in the race concept. 42% no. So this started an entire very heated dialogue in the 90s that ended up in numerous publications discussing this very nature. How can you be a biological anthropologist and believe in the concept of race, right? Especially when we had discussed, you know, the typology, the racist past that we had. So these are some of the things that we'll discuss. And then we'll also go into kind of the modern synthesis and then, you know, the time for reform, which is, you know, what we need to be doing in the future. So a lot of this started with the Big Three divide from 1990 to 2000. And the Big Three divide is that classic classification system where you force a classification of an individual into the big three major geographic regions. So Africa, Europe, Asia, which includes Native Americans as well. So they lump Asian with Native Americans. So this is the Big Three divide. And again, like I said, the concept of race, 1987. And this stimulated a series of papers in social science, I think it was, yeah, and medicine. And one of the things that we need to really discuss is Sauer's contribution. And this paper came out in 1992 and it's been highly cited. So he had a huge discussion with Armelagus, who also, all of these back and forth, right? This whole big conflict came out in print, in publications. And so one of the major reasons, you know, for calling out forensic anthropology, why are you still using the race concept, right? It's a loaded term. Why are you doing that? And I remember at the time, because I was a grad student in the late 1990s, when you'd go to the AABAs, forensic anthropology had a section, and then there was so much infighting that you'd go back the next year and then forensic anthropology section was gone. So, and this was as a grad student, right? And this was all of the back and forth between the traditional, more theoretical biological anthropologists and the subdiscipline of applied forensic anthropology. So Sauer, in his publication, clearly points out that the reason why they have the term race and they assess this parameter was a pragmatic one, right? The pragmatic one meaning when you have an unidentified person, to narrow down the search for missing people, it's helpful to have the biological sex, age at death, and also population affinity, right? Because if you only provide a couple of those parameters, the numbers are so humongous that it's not helpful to narrow the search. So in 1992, what he did was propose a name change, right? We don't use race anymore. We're going to use ancestry. And so that name change, it took a few years, but it was changed to ancestry. However, on the Armelaga side of the team, he was very skeptical about that name change. He really thought that, are you really changing your way of doing things or your methodology, or you're just, using another synonym for the same thing? So, and that kind of played out for a number of years. So another thing that we need to, and this also kind of clearly goes into, women in science in general. Alice Bruce also had a paper in the same 1992 issue. And she was extremely insightful, is that one of the things that came out in the 2000s is when we assess population affinity, now there are groupings of using the term Hispanic, right? You group a lot of these individuals into this kind of category that has been used by the census data that's not appropriately used by medical examiners when they do their coding system. They don't know what to call. And if you look at even the recent census thing, you'll see like the categories. They put countries, they put regions, they put, they have a thing for ethnicity. So even the US government has no clue, right, what these things mean, and they're collecting data, and it has changed over time, over and over again. So Alice was Dr. Bruce was very forward thinking, because she pointed out back in 1992 that, we shouldn't be using this big three typological thing of Africa, Asia / Native American / European, but that we should use more. She didn't use the word population affinity or population structure, but we should look at more regional populations or narrow down, the populations that what we're looking for, because even then she addressed and said, well, individuals, for example, let's say from Miami, Cuban origin, are very different than individuals, say, from Puerto Rican origin or from Mexico, right? They have different ethno-histories. And you can't just throw them into one pot. That, doesn't make any sense either for identification. And they're very regionally placed, right? And this is an issue with our identification efforts even today, and I'll explain that. So the interesting thing is this paper has never been highlighted, has never been quoted. We looked at this, Dr. Palud and I, when we found this, and I'm like, yeah, I've been saying this in 2000, but Dr. Bruce said that back in 1992, and no one brought it up. And so to point things out also, as women in STEM and what we have to deal with, 90% of our graduate students are women in forensic anthropology. You have a large female base. In general forensic science, it's about 80% women, but all of the positions of leadership are still held by men. And so I think there's going to be a turnaround soon, right? As these gentlemen are getting older, hopefully, and will leave their posts. So it will leave some room for the women. But this has been something that has been ingrained in our discipline, and highlights also that the dismissal of Dr. Bruce, the only paper that has ever really been highlighted, has been Dr. Sauer's paper. So then the big three divide, there was a series, it came out of a AAA conference, and it was a book that came out, Race, Ethnicity, and Applied Bioanthropology. And this continued through, and Bruce did say in one of her papers, there is something there. We don't know really what we're doing with this ancestry, which hasn't taken place yet. It was still race. But she outlined that, you know, maybe our methodology is a little bit off and we need to think about it, but again, has never been looked at. So to highlight the next part, race and politics, we have Dr. Kennedy. Why teach race identification if races don't exist, right? So this is the movement, races don't exist. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, race means subspecies, right? So zoologists have tended to use this term to mean subspecies of other species. So I don't know who was the brilliant person who decided to actually apply that to humans. It's beyond my comprehension. And then you have Armelagus, Goodman Armelagus, Smain Armelagus, Shankling. So you have this whole camp, you know, outing forensic anthropologists. And their standpoint is, I don't want to be political. I'm just doing my job from the Sauer perspective. And actually something similar came out in 2020. There was a letter to the editor in our flagship journal, the Journal of Forensic Sciences, that actually brought this to light again in light of the Black Lives Matter movement by leading researchers in this area, as well as Dr. Deconstructing and Dr. Bethard. And they questioned the use of even doing this parameter of population affinity. The reason why, because a lot of times they're still using morphological traits, right, to assess, which is very antiquated typological. Nobody should be really doing that process anymore, but they still are, especially some of our more seasoned practitioners are still using typological. And what I mean by that is you have a skull, right? And then you have a trait, let's say, to assess African ancestry. There's a, right in front of the landmark bregma, which is around here, it's called the post-bregmatic depression. So they just kind of cherry picked a lot of these traits based on really tiny sample sizes. And they picked their sources a priori. So, you know, the museum collection. So they had a collection of 30 individuals from Mexico or what have you. And this is how they propose to look at these traits. But the problem is nobody really knows the frequency of these traits in a global region. Everybody has the traits, right? So when looking at this type of thing, one of the major criticisms now is that we don't know the evolutionary process of these types of traits. So, I mean, is it, you know, is it a process of, you know, suture fusion or development, ontogeny? So those are some of the things that we really need to look at. Or is it a cultural practice? So let's say generally when you have individuals, even in prehistory, who do cradle boarding, you know, where they put the babies on the back and their cradle, they have more ossicles on their sutures, right? Because it's the process of reshaping, you know, the neurocranium. So that's actually a cultural impact for that. So some of those things have never really been assessed. I stopped using traits over 20 years ago because it felt a little wrong. But they're also questioning, I use 3D coordinates where you use size and shape, which has been used in prehistory to look at mobility patterns. You know, peopling of the New World type of thing. So craniofacial landmarks are akin to genetic distances, so we can do it that way. But Dr. Deconstructing and Dr. Bethard questioned, they actually said to put a moratorium on the race concept and not to actually assess it until we know if assessing this is actually doing more harm than good. So when we're dealing with all cognitive bias, all of these things, especially with the justice system that we're looking into, medical examiners and everything. So they questioned whether providing that that parameter would, let's say, make investigators investigate less if it was related to a group that was marginalized or underrepresented. There have been studies that say, oh no, you know, all these people have been identified, but then they're closed data, right? It comes out of, let's say, 100 individuals out of one lab, they can say this, but we have 40,000 unidentified remains at any given time in this country. It's actually our silent crises. So these are some of the things that we have to think. So then there was a response to that letter, very similar to what Norm Sauer said. We're just doing our job and it's what the law enforcement wants. This is the language they use. However, I disagree with that. I don't think you should throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think that's an extreme parameter, especially we have 40,000 unidentified individuals and our goal is to give them a name, which is a basic human right. But there are better ways to do it, more ethical ways to do it. But my view is also you can educate law enforcement. I work with them all the time. I use population affinity. I explain to them when I say this individual most likely came from Mesoamerica. And he's like, well, what does that mean? Oh, I said it could be Mexico, Guatemala, you know, it's like the regional thing. And he's like, oh, okay. You know, so they get it. So our jobs are also to inform law enforcement, inform government to make some of these changes more broadly and not use it's my job as a sad excuse. So we looked at the period of biological determinism. This is from 2001 to 2010. And we look at papers from the Journal of Forensic Sciences. And we did a search based on Ancestry, race. And then we looked at their samples. And you can tell that even amongst anthropologists, we don't know what they're doing, right? We don't know what we're doing. And you look at the racial traits of the skull, those I completely, you know, have not used and shouldn't be used. And then, you know, you have Gill in one of his book chapters stated, you know, there were these 6 races. Then after that, to continue with biological determinism, we saw a growth in ancestry studies since 2001 and 2010. And during this period is when I was writing about, we shouldn't use the term Hispanic because it has no biological meaning. Other people were, you know, looking for traits. We're looking for, looking at differences instead of looking at human variation, right? When we look at human variation from craniofacial markers, we have to think about not only evolutionary forces, right? Adaptation, whether it's climate, altitude, but also what happened in the ethno-historical context. So for example, I'm from the Republic of Panama. What shaped Panama? Well, you had the Spaniards coming in. They had established a colony there in the 1400s because when they were pilfering the gold from South America, Panama was one of the ports to get out, right? Even then, at that point in time, they brought enslaved individuals with them. So they came early on. After they arrived, a lot of the indigenous populations were decimated. They actually forcibly moved indigenous populations from different regions to South America. They forcibly enslaved individuals. What happened after in Panama, you had the colonial period, which was a caste system, right? You had Then the Americans came in and built a railroad that brought in individuals from China, Germany, other parts of the world to help build the railroad. Then we had the disastrous French Canal, where numerous individuals died of malaria and yellow fever. And then we had the huge earthworks project of the actual building of the Panama Canal, where you brought in a lot of individuals from West Indies. You had individuals from China, all over the globe coming to build this earthworks program. And in that system, in this Panama Canal Zone area, excuse me, you had, it was not only segregated geographically, but it was also segregated socially, right? So you had all of the laborers were West Indian, which was a huge number of individuals. So they were segregated geographically and socially. And then you had the elite Americans, the Europeans, were a lot smaller, living in better housing and in better systems. And that actually, believe it or not, continued even until I was in high school. I mean, we still had individuals, you know, in areas that were segregated in the 1980s. And so now the Americans are gone, have been gone for a while. So, you know, hopefully a better place. So this is, again, biological determinism. We had deconstructing race. So to summarize this area, we have the 1990s race, which is a discipline at discord. Sorry, I have to read over here because I cannot see the letter in the back. My eyes don't go that far. Again, began with the AAPAs, 2008 to 2019. Ancestry studies, again, heavily trifecta, meaning European, Asian, Native American, and African descent. And they also picked, like, one of the big things that we proposed and kind of pushed in our paper was you need to be thoughtful about your research questions, your research design. You know, there've been a lot of collections around the world, and that's another thing, the ethical accumulation of collections that have been unethically sourced has been another huge issue that has come out recently, and that's another thing we have to think about. So someone goes to, say, the Smithsonian and looks at the Terry collection, which is one of, you know, our classic collections from the 1900s. You look at European Americans. Okay, you go do a bunch of measurements. Then you go look at the Thai collection in Thailand and Chiang Mai. And then you do a comparison. Well, if they're different, what do you think? And why would we do that? What is your hypothesis, number one? What are you trying to get at? Is it evolutionary? Are you trying to get at identifications? We don't have a lot of missing Thai people in the United States, right? So those are the things, the questions. You shouldn't just do science because you can. You should do methods and set up your research design with purpose, right? So the modern synthesis in 2011 to 2020, we have a lot of these growth in validation studies of our old methodologies, right? On aging methodologies, trying them on different samples. Do they work? Do they not work? A lot of the methodologies are population specific. So that's why it's important not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Methodologies using these unvalidated GUIs. This also came out in the press that people will put out a new little program that they have online and think that you can use that for forensics. Has not been validated. You just throw it out there. One of the big key things is that you can't put out research like this, especially when you have to testify in court. Everything has to go under the federal rules of evidence. Everything needs to be, did they do good science? What are the reference samples? You can't just use whatever free software you find on the net and apply that to a forensic case and think you're going to be okay in court. It's not going to happen. But unfortunately, in the new wave of electronics and setting up your own programs and R, right? These things are out there. And there's even this one here, skull profiler, right? Just the name, skull profiler. And what they were doing in this one, this is pretty recent. You go on there and it will give you the big trifecta, Africa, Asian, European, based on a type, right? They actually have that in there. And so that's kind of concerning. So Ancestry, some of the things we have to think about. Is it a crucial component to the biological profile, like many people say? Well, we don't know yet, right? So we really need to think about that. Is giving that parameter to law enforcement, is it helping or hindering the identification? I think we need to look at that more carefully, but I also think if we have ways to be able to assess population affinity, is almost just as ethical not to provide that information. Right? Again, 40,000 unidentified individuals. Most of them are marginalized. Most of them are from underrepresented groups, undocumented border crossers, you know, lower socioeconomic status. So these are the things that, you know, kind of go through my mind every time that I work a case. Is it the most difficult parameter? Yeah, because nobody can agree on what it is, right? And what they should be doing. People are still doing antiquated things that they shouldn't be. Ancestry, race, ethnicity are all conflated by government and forensic practitioners. They don't know really what you're assessing. Some of it is cultural, some of it, you know, they say race is a social construct, but races don't exist. You know, how do people self-identify? So this kind of all gets conflated into one thing. The word ancestry was used in the title of 20 papers in JFS, and race was still used in papers in 2010 and 2011. So this is a small study that we did. These are looked at the references, and here you can see how they don't, you know, Black, white, Hispanic, African, European, Asian, prehistoric, Native American, Polynesian. Do those reference samples sound thoughtful for a study? And you have African American, European American, South Florida Hispanic, Southwest Hispanic, prehistoric population. So, you know, Japanese, that's a country, right? German, white, Black, you know, so they don't even know how to, I mean, I think ancestry, there is no actual definition for the term, so nobody really knows what they're studying. We have tried to come up with definitions, we can't. So the issue is, you know, thoughtful reference samples and what are we actually looking for and studying. Did 2 papers on prehistoric remains from Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we found was human craniofacial morphology is neutral evolutionary model. Contiguous populations are more similar to each other because you have gene flow, right? But it's, we need to abandon tricontinental approach, adopt a population structure approach, but also it depends on ethno-historical origins, right? All right, how much time do I have? I'm good? Plenty? Okay. So this is the sample from my new study that I highlight, Panama. So the samples are from Africa. Yeah, so you can see globally where you have the New Worlds, you have the Caribbean, and these are contemporary samples. These are the anatomical landmarks that I used, and I'm not going to get into this because this is what the process that I use. It's 3D geometric morphometrics, and we also use spatial analysis to look at latitude, longitude, and things like, does that affect, you know, morphology, shape? So when you use 3D, you can look at actual shape separate from size. You can't do that in traditional caliper measurements, but you can in 3D, which is really nice. So I'm gonna skip over that. Okay, so this is what we found. Our Chilean samples were closest to our Spanish sample, meaning they have, the Spaniards left a huge impact, right, on contemporary Chileans. Then you have Panama. Then you have Cuba, Guatemala, the Colombian sample grouped together. And what was really interesting was Colombia and Panama are neighboring countries. They shared borders. They were all part of the same royalty when the viceroyalty when the Spanish were there. But they're very different from each other. Why are they different? You had the Americans come in, you had the railroads, you had all of that that completely shaped what Panama looks like. And you don't have the same historical background in Colombia. You have Peru and Puerto Rico. And it's interesting that the enslaved African sample is closest to Peru because that's where the Spaniards not only moved populations from other parts of the New World, indigenous populations there, but they also brought in enslaved Africans that also left a biological mark in that country. So we look at, these are our wireframe graphs. And so these are 3D. So is there there is. So this is an orbit. This is the upper part, the below part of your nose. And these are just your vault. Again, this is a superior view, meaning looking from above, length, face, the back of your skull. And so these are some of the things that we look at. And this is how we see Chile to Spain. So you deform the teal into this and you can tell which landmarks are changing and how they're changing. So you see no differences here. And here you see differences in length and in breadth, right? So those are the kinds of things, again, you can see the length differences. So this is how we look at shape only. Again, Puerto Rico. This is the breadth, face, again, here and here. So you not only have changes in length between enslaved Africans to Puerto Rico, but also in cranial height. When we did the spatial analysis, we look at patterns of shape and size in relation to distance in kilometers, right? You can see they're both significant here. And this is shape, this is size, or what we call centroid size. And if you have an isolation by distance, which is a classic model, so you have populations, let's say, as clines, right? So the further one population moves or breaks off and moves away from here, the more different they're going to be, right? The further you move away, because you're not sharing as many genes. And this is what it's supposed to look like if you have that model, isolation by distance. So here you have the Morans, which is the spatial value that we look at. These are kilometers. So you see they're kind of small in Moran's eye. The further you get away, it comes down into the negative and then it kind of dissipates and it spreads out. What we have in this is shape. It's not the same pattern, right? And this is size. Again, this is kilometers, and these are Morans. And This we call a monotonic change. This is a non-monotonic change, is that there's no pattern, right? They're different, but this kind of pattern indicates multiple migrations from different directions, multiple times, such as the conquest, colonialism, and all of these things. So you can see these spatially, that it's not only clines, because everybody also mistakes that we only have clines, which would result in a pattern like this, but they don't take into account what humans have done themselves when they migrate, when they settle. So what is our revolution? Is ancestry is a synonym for race. Armelagos was right. Ancestry studies currently have been typological. We have been 30 years talking about the same thing, and we have to revisit and talk about the same thing yet again. We have to look at population structure approach, have real hypotheses, thoughtful questions. And one thing I want to bring this, why is this important? Why am I even talking about this, right? So as a forensic anthropologist, my job is to identify people. And I will give you an example. I said 40,000 individuals are unidentified at any given day in the United States. They don't have a name. We have about 10,000 people going missing every day too. We even have a national database called the National Missing Persons and Unidentified Systems. It's called NAMUS, where not everyone is put into the system, and they're supposed to be able to match the missing with the unidentified. Since 2008, they've only been able to identify less than 3,000 individuals. It's not a good record, and this is via DNA, right? And the one thing I'm going to say too, our systems, especially our medical examiner systems, they're still encroached in 1850s laws. One such law, and I'm going to use my own state as an example. So back in the 1850s, they passed these laws to be able to collect unclaimed bodies for the medical schools. And we're talking, St. Louis, the Terry collection, especially, and Hammond Todd. And most of the people that died in poorhouses, that died in, in different situations, and sanitariums, right, mental health institutions, because they were viewed by the elite society as not being of value and not contributing to society, they had to pay their debt to society after death. So their bodies would go straight to donation. And part of the reason they were doing that, because they had body snatchers, right? People were so terrified of it because they couldn't get enough bodies for medical schools that they would literally wait for people to get buried and go and take them. So then they started these laws. They also instituted in St. Louis, and I believe the law still holds, you have 48 hours to get your unclaimed person. 1850s, 1900s, no cell phone, no internet. All of these people here are, people fleeing Jim Crow South, people, immigrants coming through Ellis Island, Irish, all perceived as low socioeconomic class, marginalized. So these are the people in those collections. And that's why there's a whole thing now. There's a whole series of papers in the anatomical record. I think it's a January issue that talks about all of those things that we have to think about when we're doing research as well. So going back to North Carolina, our state law says, and I think this goes back to, 1900s as well. If you have an unclaimed body, so we know who they are, they're not unidentified. The unidentifieds we actually do keep, and we try until they're identified, we hold them. But if you're marginalized, you're identified, you can't afford a funeral, right? Because funeral costs skyrocketed. Only the rich can afford that. They will hold on to the remains mean, I think it's like a few days, less like a week. And if you don't claim them, they will cremate them for you, right? But they won't give their cremains back to the family members because the state paid for it. So what do? They hold on to the cremains for 3 to 4 years and then they scatter them at sea. But even though they already paid for it, right? My tax dollars already paid for it. Why don't you just hand them back to the families? But apparently they don't want to upset the people that can't afford it. So those laws are still in place and that has to be changed at the legislative level, right? I mean, a medical examiner can't change that. I mean, that's in the law. So some of these things is what we have to think about because again, are disenfranchised in life are being disenfranchised after death as well, but nobody wants to talk about the dead, right? Nobody cares about the dead. But Europe is way ahead of us. You know, having a personal identity is your basic human right. And even if you an undocumented migrant in Europe, they will chase whoever the host country is. They will make that identification. They will contact the families. They'll do whatever they can to actually return those remains to those family members so that they can, I won't say the word closure because you never get closure, but at least they'll have an understanding, especially those fleeing conflict areas and conflict zones. Okay. So again, the reform, ancestry supplanted race, move away from racialized terminology, new terminology, hypothesis, again, the big three, trait selection, and like I said before, it's time to reimagine an approach to modern human variation, contemporary views, also look at our laws and look at our collections. And like I just stated before, cremation is our new form of structural violence for those marginalized. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. I would love to know a little bit more about what you think the impact of the ancestry tests are, like ancestry DNA, on sort of how, you know, obviously your presentation is arguing that it's just reinforcing this misinformation that race isn't cultural, that it's biological, but it does seem to be, you know, continuing to gain traction. Whether it has to do with like notions of like genetic relatedness or just notions of like identity. So I'd love to know a little bit more about that impact on your work.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. One of the things that we are doing in North Carolina to give a name back to the unidentified. So we're reanalyzing everybody. We're redoing anthropology on everyone because, you know, forensic anthropology is very new from the 1970s. Methods have changed a lot. So anybody that hasn't been examined, I re-examine them with my team. We send out isotopes so we can try to do geographic origin through isotopic analysis. We also send out for DNA, and we've been using a team member of mine, my colleague is a forensic genealogist. So one thing that we are doing is uploading this special kind of DNA, because identifying DNA, there's small SNPs, and the stuff that goes out to labs is not the same type as you upload to GEDmatch or Ancestries or 23andMe. So we are using those tools to try to see if we can find family members and ask questions to see if we can finally get at an identification. And in the last 2 years, we've actually identified 7 out of the 8 that we've sent out. One from 1976, one from 81. So we're able, because individuals are uploading their DNA, right? But one of the things that we're also pushing in our standards at forensic anthropology to move away from ancestry is to disentangle us from this type of DNA ancestry. The issue is the reference samples, right? I mean, I think it's 23andMe that tells you how much Neanderthal you are, right? I mean, it gives you a proportion of that. And it's like, where did they get the DNA number one? I'm assuming it's free to be had from, Max Planck or something. And then they give you like percentages, but those percentages are mathematical percentages. It doesn't really mean you're 2%, North Korean, right? You need to know what the reference sample is. And, you look at one point, I was just talking to a colleague last night at this archaeological conference downtown. And he was like, yeah, I checked my ancestry. I checked it like, I get this note, when something happens, they add. So apparently he was 2% Bantu, which is right, a language group in Africa at one point. Then another week he was 1%, and then he became 0, and then he was back at 2%. So I think they're changing the algorithms also. So it's who's ever doing the algorithms in the background and reference samples. I can tell you right now, my DNA is not up there because the police have made mistakes. And I don't want anybody knocking on my door thinking that, my brother committed a crime or my cousin did, and I'm the one dragged out. So I don't know. But I do think it helps that was a joke, but I do think it's helped a lot with forensic genealogy and solving some of these cold cases. But then that has also come into question, right? What are the ethics of using these public databases like that? There's really no legislature. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Ross. I was interested in, the reform and the revolution slides were really provocative to me, especially in the context of your statement earlier that the George Floyd killing and the social justice movements have really propelled these conversations forward. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and which community within your field is really at the center of trying to push forward the social justice elements of the work. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I think one of the key questions has started, with systemic racism when it came out in our justice system, right? And that's when several anthropologists were questioning whether, did some introspection and thought, should we be even assessing this because look at what we see on the news and how individuals are treated individually. Another thing was the movement at the Penn Museum where they had the remains of some of their loved ones, and they were using them, unfortunately, for teaching online, and they hadn't been returned and they hadn't been identified. So they also put a moratorium on all of their skeletal collections because that collection was amassed by someone who was racist and collected those skulls, with dubious, by dubious means, right, to promote typology. So now there's a moratorium on those collections and they're trying to repatriate them. But these conversations really came forward with, with reassessment of the methodology of what are we doing, of why are we still using typology. And honestly, I wasn't paying attention, right, before either, because I was just doing my own thing. I didn't use the trait lists or anything. So I was like, I'm not doing it. And I didn't think anybody else was using them. But apparently that was been a really big hot debate, including at the consensus body of our standards. They don't want to change. You have this old guard that don't want to change. I don't know if it's fear, right? Every time you propose something new and they were like, well, why don't you just not change the name and just define what we have? I said, because what we have is wrong. So all of those things, I think, impacted, especially from the Deconstructing camp. Dr. Deconstructing really started talking about these issues, and especially when we're dealing with, you know, social issues of systemic racism in our social justice system, on how courts are dealt, how, you know, violence and things, how it's, you know, geared towards one group of people. And I think, especially when you look at the diversity or lack of diversity in forensic anthropology, you know, it's not out of the question or shocking or, you know, surprise that many feel that it's okay, right? Because there's only a handful of us that are people of color, or not too many of us. So I think a lot of that kind of started with that, is like, you don't have that insight, right? Because it's not affecting you personally. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Other questions from in the house here? We have a few from online. One, the words race and ancestry have been used interchangeably, as you talked about.
Yeah.
And how can we avoid adopting the new term, or the population affinity, and have it mean something differently? How can we avoid, I think the question is, how can we avoid?
How can we do this? How can we avoid doing the same mistake that we did before?
Right.
Got it. And that's a really good question. Other people have asked that. It's by your research design, not accepting publications that are typological and just change the name, by being thoughtful about research. And that's, I think, comes to at the level of editors and associate editors and journals that really need to be not allowing this kind of work. And advisors. If I have a grad student, one of my doc students or master's students say, hey, I just want to do this gee whiz thing, and you have to say no, right? That's not a good research question. So it's up to the advisors to step up and not allow this kind of research to go out there. Yeah, so I think, you know, a lot of us will have to really be mindful of these things.
And following up on that, or a related question, your 3D ID software program, does it support that as well? Does it go in a different direction than typology, or how is it not typological?
Right, another good question. I actually did, when I was doing my rant about the unbiological term Hispanic in the 2000s, the purpose of putting out 3D ID is to be different and not be typological. So we have been thoughtful in our process. So for example, we have a sample in there from Colombia, and I did not want to group them with any, so we have like Mesoamerican, for example, we have groups like Circum-Caribbean, but research has to happen before I even combine samples. So this paper that I presented today on the stuff with Panama and Colombia recently came out. So I left Colombia alone until we got the results, because now I know a little bit more. You know, should they go with Northern South America, right? Because they have a different historical context. Because I didn't know, should I group them with Panama because they're Panama? So obviously I cannot group them with Panama. So it would be more of that Northern South America grouping that we would do kind of in that like population structure approach.
Okay, so your reference samples are really much more scrutinized, essentially.
Yes.
Okay, great. Another a question, our last question here from an undergraduate. Forensic anthropology has been described as being applied biological anthropology.
Mhm.
What aspects of forensic anthropology have changed or diverged from biological anthropology? Or is it still the same, just a subfield of biological anthropology? Is there anything new in forensic anthropology that is not in biological anthropology?
That's a complex question. Generally, biological anthropology deals with large samples in a population level. When you deal with medical legal contexts, you're looking at a single skeleton. You can't be a good forensic anthropologist without being a really good skeletal biologist first. Otherwise, you don't know how to look at what variation looks like, right? So you need those things. The way we're different is a lot of the biological anthropology, even though in paleo, you know, they're doing more modern medical modalities like CT scanning and things like that in paleo. But in bioarchaeology, they're still staying with antiquated methods. So we have to keep up. So we actually use, like I use bone mineral density scans routinely, x-rays, CT scans, digitizers. So we're using more, I would say, modern equipment than your traditional bioarchaeologist that's kind of on a shoestring.
Sure. One last question here. How does your spatial data compare with genetic data?
Spatial data is not comparable to genetic data, but craniofacial data is, and you can use craniofacial data as a proxy for genetic data. That has been proven in many other prehistoric things. So craniofacial data here is genetically stable. Why? Because you hold a lot of structures behind your craniofacial region that if anything goes awry, you won't live. So that has been widely published, and it's known that it is akin to like a genetic proxy if you can't get DNA.
Great, thank you. Well, we're nearing the end of our time here. I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your research with us. And thank you online people for dialing in, and our audience here as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.